Everybody, and welcome to Advance Arlington's January program. Who's Breaking the News? A discussion on the state of local news and why that matters. We are pleased that you have decided to join us by Zoom this evening, and we're sorry that we couldn't do it in person, but the weather didn't cooperate. My name is Doug Taylor, and I am a board member and member of the program committee of Advance Arlington. And in my day job, I'm also a lawyer with Bean, Kinney, and Corman in Arlington. And as many of you know, Advance Arlington provides a nonpartisan and agenda-free debate format on important issues facing Arlington. And tonight's issue is no exception. Next slide, please. So, a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. First, big thanks to our sponsors. We're honored to recognize Strategic Analysis, Arlington Food Assistance Center, Sushi Zen, the Italian stores Tremonte Family, Ginger Jeffrey and John Andelin, Jean Broyhill, Ed and Anita Nolan, and the Arlington Community Foundation. Thanks to all of you for your tremendous generosity. And thanks also to our other sponsors who have supported the 70th anniversary celebration back in June, and as well as all of those who've renewed their membership for Advance Arlington this year. Next slide, please. So we've got, be on the lookout for our next program. It will be on February 12th, and you can expect more information on that topics soon. We're working on the final details of that, should be out shortly. So we hope that you'll notice a real commitment by Advance Arlington to bring forward new ideas and discussions in interesting ways. We are a volunteer and working board. We need your support, so please consider becoming a member, a sponsor, or both. Your financial support really helps Advance Arlington to cover operational and technical expenses. For over 70 years, we have honored our commitment to provide neutral and informative programming, and we don't advocate, we simply inform. Your financial support by joining as a member for this program year or by making a donation at our website ensures that the type of programming that you're seeing this evening endures, that a place for community discourse free of partisanship remains a part of the fabric of our community. Everything you need to know is at our website at advance-arlington.org. We can't do this without you, and we really appreciate your support. So now on to the program. We've got a great panel for you tonight. First up is Scott Brodbeck. He is the founder and CEO of Local News Now, which owns and operates 3 hyperlocal news websites, Arlnow, ALX Now, and FFX Now, covering Arlington, Alexandria, excuse me, and Fairfax County in Northern Virginia. LNN also partners with other DC area local news sites, including Popville and Moco Show. A former TV news writer and producer with an MBA from Georgetown University and a BA from George Washington University. Scott was a founding board member of Local Independent Online News Publishers, or LION. Scott lives in Arlington with his wife and 2 kids who attend Jamestown Elementary. And next up on our panel is Lauren Victoria Burke. Lauren has enjoyed a diverse career in journalism and politics for more than 25 years. Her first big job in journalism was as an assistant to Cokie Roberts at ABC News. She then went on to work for USA Today, The Hill, Associated Press, and The Guardian. Ms. Burke has also worked in politics in New York and Virginia, serving as a communications director on Capitol Hill and for Virginia's 41st Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax. She founded Black Virginia News in 2022 and appears on Roland Martin Unfiltered every Thursday. She is a graduate of the American University. So for our Zoom participants for tonight, please submit your questions in the Q&As, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. And we thank those of you who submitted questions in advance of the program tonight. So with that in mind, panelists, let's get underway. We've got a bunch of really interesting questions. I'm going to start out with some really broad topics. Feel free to go wherever you want to go with these, and Tell us what your thoughts are. So the first questions we received are, what changes over time have you seen in news coverage in general? And that would be at all levels. And give us some idea of why you think those changes have occurred. Scott, do you want to start with that?
Oh boy, that's it's a lot to digest. So, the news industry is very challenged right now, because we are going through a long transition. And that transition is a time of print and broadcast being the primary place where you get your news, to a time where the internet is where you get your news. It comes as no surprise. Like, this is not advanced level stuff. Everybody knows the internet's here, but I think what maybe is lost in this decades long transition is that this is going to be a pretty is the extent to which the legacy media as it existed is largely going away or changing dramatically. And so, in the instance of what we're doing here, in the suburbs of Northern Virginia and DC area, we are an online, founded in 2010. So we've been doing this for almost 15 years, actually coming up on 15 years. And the thesis here is that, the news coverage as we knew it in Northern Virginia, the Sun Gazette, and the weeklies covering these areas, eventually a transition needed to take place online. What these papers had, and you can include the Post and other similar Metro Weekly paper or Metro Daily papers in this as well, is that part of their moat, part of what made them work was the physical aspect of you need a printing plant, you need distribution trucks. Maybe the Sun Gazette didn't quite need that, but nonetheless, there was a big barrier to be a newspaper. You had a lot of physical fixed costs. And with the internet, you don't need that at all. I literally launched Arlnow on a whim one night, launched a WordPress site overnight, workshopped the name over 24 hours, and that's how this whole thing started. And so, these are two very different models, a model where anybody can launch anything versus a model where you needed a broadcast antenna or a printing plant. And so this is a long-winded and kind of technical answer to this, but that is a transition that's been happening for decades. It's going to continue happening. The Post just announced layoffs, almost 100 people. We're going to continue to see this, and it's really shaping the landscape of local news, and the economics of it determine what a local news outlet can and cannot do.
That's great. Lauren, how about things from your point of view? You want to address those topics?
Yeah, I mean, everything has completely changed from when I started. Certainly, one of the biggest changes is speed and the news cycle. Certainly, when I started, newspapers were the king, and your news cycle was 24 hours generally. Now, effectively, there is no news cycle. The news cycle is minutes in some cases with some of these stories. Obviously, the other big thing is that the technological world allows anyone to effectively define themselves as a journalist. And when you see things from a legal standpoint, like the Julian Assange case, when you see that people are using sort of the cover of journalism in any way, shape, or form, and of course, the First Amendment sort of dictates that anybody could really actually claim to be a journalist, but the technology really allows anybody to deliver information. So just like any other business, there's a supply and demand quotient. And a lot of ways for information, supply is meeting demand, because that supply is coming through Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, X, any platform that allows somebody to transmit information. That puts a ton of pressure on anybody who's doing any sort of legacy journalism or anybody who does journalism contemporaneously in the new technological world. So obviously, when I started, it was a newspaper-based business for the most part, and then I watched a bunch of newspapers go out of business. And what we have now is sort of an amalgamation of anybody deciding at any moment that they want to do something journalistic. I also happen to believe that we live in what I would define as the golden age of defamation. Like, anyone can sort of do anything. The platforms have the protection of Section 230. And the legacy media has the protection of Tom Sullivan. I actually do happen to think Tom Sullivan will go down at some point because some of these moments of defamation have been quite quite huge. They've changed history in some cases. And so that change in journalism is huge. I mean, some of the things I've seen printed and published would have never been printed and published when I worked at ABC News in the late 1990s. Without some deep fact checking, you're seeing things now getting thrown out there pretty on a regular basis that are not verified as factually true. And that's a huge change. And a lot of that is happening because of speed, because what you get rewarded, the way you get rewarded in today's journalism is having things up first and serving the algorithm. And so that has sped things up a great deal.
Well, thanks for that. I'm going to ask you a related question that you addressed partially, but what do you see as the future of local news coverage? You mentioned the speeding up of the news cycle and different media for providing that coverage. What's coming up? What's coming down the pike in the pipeline in your view?
I actually think what Scott does is the future of journalism, where you have local, targeted, niche journalism for the local community. And Scott does that really well with all of his platforms. People are really responding to that. And obviously it really helps you on the business end with local advertising. That type of money happens because you have that niche audience, particularly in a place like Nova, which is one of the wealthiest places in the country. So when you are able to target a particular group of people, and that group of people is fairly well-to-do, it really does work, particularly if you're delivering it like the platforms that Scott is delivering. I mean, it absolutely works, that model. I think that is obviously the future. You do see Substack blowing up, but the WordPress platform, I think, is a lot better in terms of moving advertising than Substack is right now. Maybe Substack changes that at some point, but right now, that model of targeted audience and serving that targeted audience, to me, is really the future.
Scott, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Lauren, by the way. I would say that, yeah, I think I agree with that. Niche is sort of the way things are going. The more generalist you are, unless you are a very large player, like, the New York Times or, I don't know, ABC News, unless you are a very large player with, a strong business and a very recognizable brand name, if you're in the middle here, where you kind of are a generalist, but you're not that big, you are going away. So we're kind of getting a barbell, and the very big guys and the very small guys. And what you need to do as a very small guy, and I, put myself in that bucket as well, is you really need to super serve a given niche audience. Now, for us, we have a staff of 8 on the editorial side, 4 on the business side, which makes us actually one of the larger independent online news publishers in the country, believe it or not. But that staff size is being supported, as Lauren said, by advertising, and to some degree, members of our Arlnow Press Club, people who pay us like $10 a month. Substack, which Lauren also mentioned, is also a very interesting model where, like, you can be a single content creator on a very niche topic. But if it's something that people are really highly engaged with and that they need that information, then they're very likely to, they're a lot more likely to pay you than if you're just creating very general content for a general audience. We lived in a world where being a generalist made a lot of sense because, again, you had these high costs of your news operation. You wanted to serve as many people as possible. And the competition was limited by who had the capital to be able to launch one of these, a broadcast outlet or a newspaper. In a world where anybody can launch a Substack, you really need to stand out. And so, we're trending in that way. I could probably talk about AI and the impacts that'll have down the road, but I've said a lot, so I will digress for now.
I was going to ask you about that. So do you want to go ahead and address that? I think it's an interesting topic. We just we had a program at the end of last year on AI in education in Arlington. So what's your take on AI in local news?
So, AI, generative AI just entered everybody's radar just a couple years ago. It has not been a thing that we've been using for very long, but yet here we are, and ChatGPT is something that millions upon millions of people use every day. This is a technology that will absolutely reshape media, and I mean media in a broad sense, because it'll also, help with the generation of videos and all sorts of things. It's not just text. I don't have a crystal ball to tell us exactly how, what direction this is going to take, but I can tell you, how we're using it right now. Right now, generative AI cannot, it's not a human reporter. It cannot go out and see that, there are permits for Whole Foods outside of 1550 Crystal Drive. We found out about that because someone saw that in person. Likewise, it doesn't have the capability of taking that information and then gathering on its own additional information that you can turn into a story. I don't think it's going to have that capability, at least not in a, the traditional sense as you think of a human reporter in at least 5 to 10 years, although I wouldn't rule it out happening eventually. Mm-hmm. For the time being, what AI is doing is it's providing us a way, and this is in action right now, for us to take our existing reporting and content and remix it in a way such that we talked about niches. It allows us to repackage it, summarize it, putting it in different forms such that we can reach different audiences in ways that they want to be served. So right now we have Press Club members. We just launched this week. They're getting a new email newsletter with like a 2-sentence summary of each story. And that is AI generated. And we have a number of other uses of AI, but I'll let Lauren take the ball here and tell. Love to
Lauren,
hear
if you would. And also, I'd like to build on that a little bit. We had a question about different platforms, newspaper, TV, radio, podcasts, and their impact on local news. So can you address those, and also the big one, AI?
Yeah, I mean, AI obviously is coming and it's here. I think it helps out a little bit if you're writing some sort of a general background paragraph on somebody, particularly if it's an obit or something like that. It can be sort of helpful to get launching. But as Scott just alluded to, at some point, particularly if you're doing niche journalism, it's very hard to duplicate that and have a machine do that. If you're standing in a room and there's no other, person there who's a reporter and you're pretty much it, which happens a lot with niche journalism, I'm not sure how AI duplicates that. The other place I think AI does sort of, I think, threaten to almost take over is anything involving images. In another life, I was a contract photographer for Associated Press, and I'm having trouble believing that, for graphics and for photography, that you're going to need that for very much longer when AI is duplicating those things. And, right before I signed on, I was actually in one of the apps on my phone creating a bunch of images of the Speaker of the Virginia House, Don Scott, who I don't have enough images of, right? So if I don't have enough images of him and I need an illustration of him, I can use AI to duplicate more images of him or anyone else. So that, I think, is going to be a huge challenge for Associated Press photos and Getty Images and all of those legacy providers of illustrated content, And as far as, local news is concerned with regard to podcasting and all that, I mean, the biggest thing, and to just sort of widen the lens a little bit, is that the increased competition on everybody is through the roof, because anyone can produce a very high level content product that you could not have produced only maybe 10 to 15 years ago. And I can remember when I was working at ABC News, there was no way in the world that you could have done any sort of video segment that was 2 or 3 minutes without 4 people being involved. Usually a producer, an audio person, a camera person, and somebody else. Now on my phone, I can produce that. And so you've increased the level of competition. And as you can see, particularly on YouTube, you have a lot of people who do shows who are quite good at content and quite good at creating a product that is in direct competition with legacy media. And so for the locals, and the locals are starting, I think, to catch up, not only on Substack, but in other ways. For the local news media, they're starting to figure that out. And I think that level of competition, I actually think the competition makes everybody better, But it is extremely hard to compete, though, in a world where, as I say, supply is meeting demand in a lot of cases.
I
Scott,
would just,
yeah, go ahead if you would.
yeah, agree with all that. And yeah, I'll just speak to podcasts. We've for the past few years, we've kind of on and off done podcasting, and we'll try something. Maybe it'll be a interview, maybe it'll be a news discussion, but in the end, because we're kind of smaller and operating on a local level here, it never really made sense from a business standpoint for us we weren't getting podcast advertising on it. And it was, a fair amount of work for everyone. But fundamentally, I know I listen to a ton of podcasts. You look at the trends, people are listening to podcasts. So I think we're going to be trying something new this year, podcast wise, in terms of like the human spoken podcast, where we're interviewing people or having discussions among our staff. But we actually just with the AI augmented email newsletter I mentioned, and we'll tie this back to AI, that the other component of that is we created an AI generated podcast of daily news summaries. So it'll take all the reporting we did over the course of a day. It'll write a approximately 3-minute script that summarizes the news of the day. And then an AI generated voice will voice it. And then the only step I couldn't automate, so I created this all in one night using a tool called Zapier, using the OpenAI ChatGPT capabilities. And the only thing I couldn't automate was getting the podcast, getting the MP3 file into our podcasting tool to like actually upload it and let people listen to it. So that I have an assistant doing. But this is something when we launched the Press Club, our membership service, like a few years ago, that was ultimately the goal, was to have that daily podcast, summary. And we had to have a person write it, record it, upload it, etc. And it took time. It didn't get uploaded until later at night. We hired someone out of college, and she just didn't know Arlington that well. And so the scripts, I needed to approve and edit the scripts. And now it's done in approximately 15 seconds, automated every day. Our reporters and editors get to focus on, the actual work of reporting and editing stories. And this gets uploaded for people to listen to, and, listen to 3 minutes of local news in their car. It's transformative when you think about it that way. We literally had to hire someone for $60,000 a year to do that. What we're now doing for pennies per day in 15 seconds.
Yeah, I'm going to switch topics on you a little bit here. We had a question that was, you often hear, if it bleeds, it leads, as far as news content is concerned. A couple of things. Is that still true? What impact does that kind of news have on local communities? And also related to, if that's not it, how do you make local news interesting?
Well,
Scott,
it's definitely still true. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I'm the daughter of a cop, and crime, violence, anything involving conflict generally will get somebody to click the link. Most people who are aware of the metrics behind what they're doing in terms of content creation are aware of what gets attention and what gets clicked first. You can see certainly with local news that, no matter where that conflict may be happening, what I find particularly in the Nova area, because the Nova area, frankly, doesn't have a lot of violent crime, doesn't have a lot of murders, doesn't have a lot of that. What you'll see a lot of times with local news is they'll tell you about the crimes happening someplace else to get that to be the first or second story, because what they're trying to do is get that viewer to stay with them through the first 10 to 15 minutes of the show. And generally speaking, with metrics online, there are 3 topics that are the main topics that get people's attention just more generally, and that's usually sports, celebrity, and money. But certainly if it bleeds, it leads is a something a lot of journalists may not want to admit to, but certainly it is definitely the case that that type of subject matter gets a lot of attention. It's unfortunately because if you see right now we're in a period where actually crime is down. It doesn't seem to matter whether it's down or up. News organizations will do what they have to get you to pay attention. And in a world where attention is extremely divided by so many things, that's getting harder and harder. So crime coverage is one of the standards in terms of news coverage to get people's attention and keep it.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the media is a reflection of society, whether society wants to believe that or not. Media, the organizations that you call the mainstream media, they are primarily there to provide people with what they want to read or view. Movie studios want to create hits. News outlets, there was a glorious time, that lasted a few decades in the heydays of newspapers, where the economics of a newspaper were so lucrative that the editorial product kind of became this independent thing where editors were deciding what stories should go based on whether they believed it important or not. I'd say we're reverting to a time now where it's a little more directly like, what is it that our audience actually wants to read? Now, you can make a case for both of those being, having virtues. Should we rely on a class of editors to decide what is important for us and what is not important, or should we based on what people in the community actually want to know about? I'd say right now we have, at least as far as our operation goes, it's a bit of a hybrid, and I think we're typical in that here in the United States, news organizations generally will local news organizations will generally try to prioritize things that they think is relevant to the functioning of democracy. So politics, what the county board does here in Arlington, we're covering those things whether people read it or not. We're going to give people their steak and vegetables. But the other classes of things we cover, business openings and closings, certainly public safety matters, both fire department and police department actions. Those are among our, the things that people have shown us over years that they are interested in. It's what we get tips on. It's what gets read. So you can have all sorts of philosophical debates here as to what is news, what should be news. But is crime, how, to what degree should it be prioritized in terms of coverage? I would just say that if you're going by what it is, if you're covering things that people are not reading, then what sort of impact are you having? And I think the best model here is some sort of combination of things that are important and things that are interesting to readers, whatever that may be.
Okay, we're going to switch topics just slightly here. So what can you give us a sense of what feedback you receive from different communities, the business community or minority communities, for example, about the importance or value of local news coverage? Okay, Lauren.
I get a lot of feedback. I get a ton of feedback on from a lot of different people across Virginia. I'm surprised often at the reach of the newsletter. Always surprised. But people find things out in communities that they're not necessarily in, and they're interested to see what's going on. Some of those people are members of the community. Some of the people are members of the Black community and don't necessarily know what's going on, maybe in Hampton, and maybe they live in Fairfax. Or some folks are not in the Black community and they just want to know what other communities are doing. As far as the business community, for ads, I get solicited on a fairly regular basis. But it's it's interesting because there's a lot of options out there for advertising now, because in the digital age, you can do so much across the board with advertising in so many different ways. And one of the things that's a challenge is because I write about politics a lot and the platform does have a lot of political content, a lot of advertisers don't really necessarily want to be adjoined to that. So it's kind of interesting that battle, but it's okay. And it's understandable because we live in a contentious political age right now. One of the other things that I kind of think of when it comes to local journalism is that the not-for-profit model sort of dictates that you are not doing any partisan politics, and in fact can't under that model. So that has been an option for advertisers as well. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of feedback. Most of it is great. I'm really open to critical feedback. I'm fine with that. And it's been interesting. I'm always sort of surprised at the reach of a newsletter or of a political platform. I mean, I'm sorry, of a journalistic platform. And that's been exciting.
So we don't get much feedback that I would classify as trying to be representative of a given community. And we don't, most of the feedback we get is in this form of email or tips. I can speak a little bit to businesses. We have some interesting interactions in the business community. So, typically our coverage of businesses is in the context of a business opening or closing, and oftentimes that's restaurants. And when we try to report on the opening of a business or of a restaurant, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes they try to be very secretive in the beginning about what they're doing. They don't want to talk. They want to they want to save it for some big theoretical announcement. And so, our reporters will contact them and try to get information, and they won't respond, or they say, oh, we'll tell you at some later time, but we're not going to tell you when that is. Later time will be. And then what inevitably happens is they open. We write about them being open. Lots of people go to that business and say, hey, and try them out and say, oh, I saw you on Arlnow. And then after that, their PR people will incessantly contact us and try to get us to write stories about them being open. And we're like, we already did that. So I would classify that as maybe love-hate's a little strong of a terminology here in terms of our relationship with the business community, but I think it's in that ballpark.
So we had a question from a participant. Are there any local news media in Spanish? We used to have Tiempo Latino. And a related question submitted by Gail Perry: how can news coverage be expanded to markets that have limited access?
That's a good one. Yeah, so Virginia has an issue with lack of broadband in some places in the Commonwealth. That is always extraordinary to me. My mother's house is in Suffolk, Virginia. And I mean, I know people who are living in Newport News, when they change rooms from the living room to the kitchen, the broadband is out. I mean, I never can get over that. But it is definitely a huge challenge, and it needs to be fixed, because that's one of the biggest reasons why people, don't have the access to information. And of course, without the internet, a lot of business cannot be conducted. Even though half of my family, my mother's side, is from Virginia, my father's side of the family is from New York, grew up in New York. And the question with regard to Spanish newspapers, of course, when I was growing up in New York, every single community had its own press and its own newspaper, which is extremely exciting because, you'd have papers that were in completely different languages. You could learn about a community, in my case, provided it was written in English, about what that community was doing by just reading the paper from that community, which is an amazing thing. I'm not well versed on the community papers with regard to the Hispanic community. I'm sure that there are some out there, but it is funny. Virginia has several growing populations, Asian and Hispanic being two of them, and I'm expecting that someone in that community is going to pop up with a publication at some point, because those growing populations are going to have specific news for those communities, and it's going to be exciting to watch when those folks start doing some Substacks or something related to that community.
Yeah, I mean, here in the DC area, you have Telemundo 44, which does, Spanish language news. I believe there is at least one Spanish language paper that's still in publication regionally, but I also cannot name it and don't know for sure. I know, print's been challenged. There's absolutely, a need to reach that community in a unique way that speaks to it and talks to some of the issues that are important. But everything's going to evolve here because, the language barriers become less of a barrier. We're going to go back to AI right now. It used to be, if you're trying to do a machine translation of an English language article, it was going to be terrible. And you were not serving Spanish language readers well by, trying to get one of these earlier versions of a, electronic translator to translate an article. Or, if you had to have someone on staff, that requires scale that is far beyond what we can do. AI actually makes good translations possible, and I think it's only going to get better. So, just in terms of the straight language barrier, that's not going to be the thing that differentiates the, let's call it the Latino press in the DC area. What's going to differentiate it is the approaches to coverage and what you're focusing on and how you speak to that community. So I do think that that'll probably evolve away from, a newspaper, a general newspaper where the differentiation used to be more so the language. And it's going to be more about, I could absolutely see Substacks starting. I think that there are opportunities like to do something like that right now. And I'd love to see someone start that, but I'm not aware of any at the moment.
We had an audience member ask a question to you, Scott. To Scott's point about publishing what people want to read, what metrics do you look at when you're thinking about what people want to read?
We're looking at a few things. There's readership of the articles, of course. But there's also, are people emailing us tips about a given story?
Yeah.
If people are motivated enough to email us about it, then that's kind of a signal for us. So, social media, seeing people talk about it on social media, if it's going viral on Instagram locally, that's a signal we might use to figure out that that's something that people in the community want to know about. We have comments on our stories, and so in terms of the post publication, weighing whether something was people were interested in it. There might be some stories where it's not the best read story of the day, but there was a lot of discussion and it generated a kind of community discussion on a given issue. That kind of, it's not just one metric of views. It's views, but also like how engaged were people in terms of taking actions or talking about a given story or spending time on reading the article as well.
Lauren, anything you want to add to that? How do you determine what content you're actually looking at? Do you look at particular metrics, or how do you determine popularity?
Well, typically it's going to be something that, is not covered enough in our view, or is not being covered at all, because it really doesn't make any sense to try to compete with some big legacy content platform on a story that they're already doing. So, typically the smaller and the more exclusive it is, the more attractive it is to throw up there. Black Virginia news. That's not easy to do because, so much is covered, but, you'd be surprised, like you can sometimes get into a room that nobody else is in, but it's a big challenge. Obviously, if you're covering like the Virginia General Assembly or Congress, that's going to be hard, to get an exclusive, unless you've got some sort of exclusive interview. We did get an exclusive interview with the Speaker of the Virginia House this week, but that's hard to do. But that's usually what it is. It's usually the niche on top of the niche, so that's typically, I do look at the metrics just like anybody else, but that's typically not the number one driver.
We had another audience member who asked, what do you think is the future of editorial news? Will we see op-eds and considered letters to the editor moving forward? What's the role of those two things in local news?
You know what? I happen to think that if for local news, I think op-ed and opinion is fantastic because a lot of times you'll learn something that you didn't know anything about on a very localized and specific level. More globally and more generally, I think op-eds and opinion has kind of meant has been problematic for legacy news because it's sort of taken over the narrative in a lot of cases in a way that I think is not particularly helpful. Op-eds, though, get a lot of traffic. Strong opinion gets a lot of traffic. So you're seeing a lot of platforms that are built primarily around strong opinion and not fact-based investigative content. Fact-based investigative content is very expensive. So news organizations like to throw out the opinionist. Now, on a local level, what I've noticed is that I enjoy it a lot more on a local level than I do on a national level. But because it is very cheap to have an opinionist, you're seeing opinion that is not based in any investigation whatsoever or any real sort of fact checking. So it's been, problematic. When I started in journalism, the investigative piece was the point of everything. You won the Pulitzer and you got attention because you investigated. That was sort of the Watergate era, the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, still with that Watergate era of journalism. Now we're getting into anybody can write anything, opinion off the top of their head, there's an opinion, and it gets a lot of traffic. So there it is with my view of opinions and op-eds.
So for a few years, or a few years ago, we published letters to the editor, and we had actually opinion columnists, and we tried to get a variety of views represented with our columnists who would publish every week or every other week. And a few years back, we discontinued that altogether and just stopped publishing any opinion content beyond reader polls. And the reason we did that, there were a few reasons, but it became apparent to me that the relationship people had with the media was changing. It used to be, Washington Post would publish, the whole opinion section, and you'd have a variety of opinions. Maybe some were represented more than others, but it was kind of understood to be this bundle of opinions, and not necessarily something that colors your view of the news content of the paper. And newspapers were a big bundle. You also got the comic page. You got the comics. You got the Best Buy flyer with all the latest video games. I'm going back to my childhood here. But you got all these different things, and they were all understood to be kind of these separate parts of the whole bundle. And over time, as more news has moved online and the newspaper's gotten thinner as a bundle, people have changed their relationship with this, where they understand everything coming from a given news brand as representative of that brand. And so we had people getting mad at Arlnow for a given person's opinion, even though they might agree with the other 4 weekly columnists. That one weekly columnist who had a voice was kind of giving us a bad name, and we get lots of people mad about something. And these are just kind of opinions well within the mainstream, let's call it. And likewise, what I noticed with letters to the editor were that they weren't representative of the community as a whole. They were representative of people who had the wherewithal to write a letter to the editor. And there's also the matter that anybody with an opinion has an opportunity to voice it now. You have social media, you have the comments on our articles, which you could do in real time. And so, why were we elevating certain voices with certain opinions and putting stamping our brand on it, and kind of taking some hits from people who didn't like certain opinions? So we have scrapped all that, and we are all fact-based reporting, other than the aforementioned reader polls at this point. And I would say that I stand by that being the right call. And if some of our former columnists wanted to launch a Substack, wanted to, have opinions on social media, we'd view them, and maybe occasionally we'd link to them or quote them in a story. But the idea of that being, something that's from us, I think we made the right call there, and the uproar against the Washington Post with their decision not to publish the presidential endorsement this year and losing 250,000 subscribers, I'd say shows what happens when you wait too long to make a decision like that. They obviously that was a mistake on the Post part at the very least to do it when they did it. And I'm not going to get into the whole rationale of why they did that, but I think what we're seeing in terms of pulling back on endorsements by some of these major legacy players is kind of the direction it was going to head anyhow, because it becomes as you're alienating part of your audience, and you cannot afford to do that anymore.
We had a question come in from John Andelin, who asks, nonprofits in Northern Virginia are providing wonderful support to youth, elderly, homeless, those with disabilities, etc. What role does the press have in supporting those efforts?
In supporting given like nonprofits?
I think that would be it. Does the press have any role in supporting the efforts of local nonprofits?
I mean, I think the duty we owe our readers is to provide them with information that's useful and interesting for their daily lives. Whether we have in the past, published articles, around Giving Tuesday of here, some local nonprofits. We do some kind of good news features on what a given organization is doing. We keep up with AFAC and, their record need, but within a lot of that is, the fundamental belief that we think our readers want to know that stuff. I don't think it's within our purview to try to boost certain nonprofits just for the sake of doing that. I mean, I guess we could if we wanted to, or anybody else could. But my focus is just trying to run a business where we can afford to pay full-time reporters to give people local news. That's my main focus, and so I'm less focused on trying to pick and choose which nonprofits we should try to promote to readers outside the context of news coverage.
Lauren, what's your take on that? Should supportive nonprofits have a role in local news media coverage?
I don't have too much to add there. Typically, there is an ad break for nonprofits, and certainly, depending on what it's about, I tend to give a lot of deference to anybody who's working on anything involving poverty, homelessness, giving away food, that type of thing. They usually get a free ad, or some sort of article or a blurb or something, because that's the type of stuff that doesn't get enough attention, in my view. So certainly, depending on what it is, it can get some sort of, freebie attention from me, certainly.
We're going to switch a little bit to talk about politics. We're going to get to it sooner or later. So John Weisted asked, how effective are media political endorsements of candidates, and do endorsements compromise community trust in news source? Lauren, do you want to take?
Well, endorsements are to me, one of the things that I think is not particularly understood by the public, or is that the editorial page typically is, of course, the group of people who decides an endorsement. They're completely separate and apart from the reporting side of your typical news organization. Okay. But the fact of the matter is, we live in a world increasingly in journalism where journalism is becoming increasingly partisan, and very obviously partisan. So obviously partisan that it's almost becoming ridiculous to even say that there is any such thing as objectivity. And it wasn't just something that we learned in the Fox News case with regard to Dominion voting machines, or watching MSNBC and noticing that, some of the personnel were working at the White House, 3 weeks before. I mean, there's certain things that are so obviously partisan that I think the public doesn't even recognize that when an endorsement is made, it's actually the editorial board, the opinion side of the paper, that is making that endorsement. So there's that. They see the logo of the paper. Let's say it's the Washington Post. They see the logo of the Washington Post endorsement, and then that's it. Typically, the candidate is going to put out some sort of flyer with the Washington Post logo, and I was endorsed by the Washington Post. And as somebody who has had a very diverse career in which I've worked for politicians and been in the media, I've been in some of these endorsement meetings and it's always, interesting to me at the end of the day. And, I worked for a candidate who was endorsed by the Washington Post. That was our 41st Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax. And we did just that. We put out the flyer, et cetera, and so on. Now, as you can see with the Washington Post, they have new ownership. Obviously, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, and he decided, as everyone knows, not to do an endorsement in the presidential race for the first time in, what was it, 3 decades? The timing, as has been mentioned already, was atrocious on several fronts. Okay, and then you have this decision and really kind of an explanation for the decision. It's not particularly satisfying. And I just think it was not a particularly good idea. But if it's articulated correctly, what you're doing, what the endorsement means, who at the paper or who at the platform is doing the endorsement, all of these things can work. But we are entering an age of journalism. It's not different than what we saw in the early part of the 1900s, the yellow journalism period. I mean, journalism has always had a political tinge. The owners of platforms have always added their political views to what they were doing. So that's not new. But in this age, we have it with misinfo and disinfo and a lot of sort of, I would say, nefarious activity attached to it, in particular, that oftentimes is not accurate. So when you put all of that together, that has complicated the endorsement process. And so it's complicated. It's a very complicated thing. So a lot of papers are starting to bail out of it. And that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I would agree that I just don't think I think we're asking too much to at this point for readers to try to differentiate what an unnamed editorial board, none of the members of which they can name, has done versus what the difference between that and that Washington Post logo endorses, between differentiating that and the paper's editorial or news coverage. It doesn't make sense for average people to understand that there's a difference, as many times as you can say there is one. So in this world, and also we're not in the world where the legacy newspapers are putting out fat profits and could have huge newsrooms, and do all sorts of do these various things because might as well, they're making 40% profit margins. I think we need to, at this point, we need to get down to the fundamentals of what do we need to be doing here as a local news source, and that's reporting local news. And I think you can report local news rigorously and report the facts, what people are saying, what they're doing, what the results are of various policies, and people are as a collective, smart enough, I think, to kind of draw their own conclusions here. But to John's original question, I don't think endorsements matter one bit anyhow. And this is why I think the brouhaha over the Post was, in the end, tempest in a teapot, because most major papers in the U.S., if they endorse someone, they endorse Harris this time around. Not all, but most. And you had all these celebrity endorsements as well. And where did that end up? Where did we end up? There was a time of institutional trust, and it was a fleeting time and not a normal time. It's not something we've had throughout history. It's just there was a period, a couple of decades, where your Walter Cronkites and your Washington Posts, where that brand, that imprimatur, I was trying to say a fancy word there and totally messed it up, where that brand it really meant something, and there was a level of trust with the public. It just doesn't exist anymore. And as much as we might pine for it and have nostalgia for how the news industry once was. It's just not that way. And I think we need to live in reality. And that reality is that endorsements, even if we're making them, are not really having that much of an impact in the real world at the voting booth.
In a related question on community trust in news sources, Susan Sheets asked, how does the local press avoid being influenced by politicians and big money?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, that's really difficult because no matter what anybody says, if you have somebody who buys some sort of ad for a month that's funding a bunch of stuff, it is going to be in the back of your mind and if they get involved in some sort of news story, it's going to be in the back of your mind. And in Virginia, we have several moneyed interests that not only influence, in my view, our media, but certainly our elected officials. And there's no way anybody can tell me that that is not an influencing factor. It is definitely a problematic feature. One of the good things about the subscription model, when you can have as little as 2,000 people subscribing at a very small amount of money. And because you have that number of people subscribing, none of those people as an individual has a lot of influence. The influence comes when you have one actor that's giving you a lot of money. So one of the good things about the subscription model is that you don't have that issue of the influence game in the same way that you have it when you had like one big advertiser who was buying in the newspaper era, a back page or a full page ad to the tune of a lot of dough. So that is a huge factor. It is always a problematic feature, and it's definitely something that has to be kept an eye on when you have a platform, no doubt.
Well, so for us, we do get political ads, but no given political advertiser made up more than 0.1% of our revenue last year. And so, I think we're able to, because we have a diversified, we have a lot of advertisers, and we're becoming increasingly diversified with subscriptions, as mentioned. That really helps us to maintain our independence. We don't have an over-reliance on any one client, and at the same time, I think there's an element of here that I'm just kind of, in terms of, the Arlington scene, I'm a bit reclusive. I don't try to hang out with, the people in power socially. I go home and, play with my kids, talk to my wife, watch football on TV. I'm not trying to, I'm focused more on running my business and living my life and not, hanging out with the people who are making these decisions. And I think that, if you become too close, too friendly with the people you're covering, you can find yourself in a situation where that colors what you're doing. And I've tried to avoid that over the past 15 years. Not all, I'm not going to claim that it was totally for virtuous reasons. It's mostly because I don't want, I'd rather be doing other things other than, hanging out with people in courthouse. But there are a number of ways here. It's also, just being determined, whether it be the ownership or, the person who's running the business, just being determined not to maintain that independence and being kind of a stubborn SOB at times. Luckily, us in the media tend to be stubborn SOBs a lot of the time, which sometimes, makes people think that, colors their opinion of the media in general. But you do need it when you're, dealing with the fire hose of reader and public opinion coming your way, and you're just a couple people in a small co-working space. You kind of need to be able to take that feedback, digest it, and do the thing that you think is right rather than the thing that people are telling you to do sometimes.
Okay, that's great. We are reaching the end of our time. So I'd like to thank you both for a terrific discussion. Wish we had more time. There are definitely more questions. Thank you to board member Krista Jones, who was really the driving force behind tonight's program, and Jean Broyhill, who as chair of Advance Arlington, pretty much holds everything together. So thank you, Jean, for all you do. Please visit our website and donate or become a member of Advance Arlington now. and join in the conversation. So we look forward to seeing you in February 12th, 2025 for our next program. And we should have more information out to you soon. Thank you, everybody.